Spiritum tuum et creevantur.
Et renovabis pacem tebe.
Oremus Deus qui corda fidelium Sancti Spiritus illustrats in locuisti dormis in eodem spiritu rectus sapere et de eius semper consolatione godere per Christum Dominum nostrum.
Amen.
Sed sapientiae
Ora pro nobis.
in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. So we're on page 23 of the notes, at the top of the right-hand corner. The proclaiming of Hildebrand, everybody desiring him to be the next pope, the successor of Alexander II. So when the enthusiastic shouts died away, Hildebrand ascended the ambo and entreated the clergy and people to turn their thoughts upon another subject. But Cardinal Hugo Candidus immediately arose and appealed to all present. You all see to what a degree of prosperity the Holy Archdeacon, I'll need for a comma there, the Holy Archdeacon has raised the Church. We shall find no one so well qualified to undertake the government and defense of this city. All of us, cardinals and bishops, together with you, choose him as the sovereign pastor of our souls. So after that, there's no need for a conclave, of course. These words drew forth new transports of joy, so everybody was even happier with it than they had been previously. And Hildebrand was forced, in some sense, to yield to the unanimous voice of the faith. Nobody can force anyone to accept the papal election, and we'll see that amongst the immediate successors of St. Gregory VII. We'll see that very clearly, that nobody can be forced to accept the papal election. We'll see the particulars of that, but long story short, it is in fact a case in point, a concrete case of really the thesis in a historical example of the applications of the principles of the thesis. Applied to a different set of circumstances, of course, very different, but still all the exact same principles employed. And we'll see that. So definitely nobody can force the papal authority upon someone who has been designated to that. That comes from Christ himself directly, as you know, and so nobody can force that. No human being can force that to be granted, but they can. He is yielding in a sense, forced in the sense of finally being prevailed upon to freely accept by the strength of the requests of everybody who was present at that moment. He was invested with the purple and the tiara, and was raised to the chair of St. Peter in April of 1073 under the ever illustrious name of Gregory VII. So Hildebrand's modesty was overcome, but he had yet one hope left. The last regulations made by the sovereign pontiff, so the previous, either Alexander II or some of his immediate predecessors, they made some modifications to the rules of electing a new pope, left to Henry IV the right of confirming the papal election. So Gregory, under the title of Pope-elect, sent a deputation to beg the emperor that he would refuse to sanction the election of the Romans. So, should you approve the choice made in my person, he wrote, I must warn you that I shall not pass over the scandalous disorders of which all good men accuse you. So Henry IV, we saw that, is clearly of low character, to say the absolute least. And Hildebrand is following he really is Pope at this point, in the sense that the confirmation of the emperor really is something that is procedural, and if that were even not to be sought and still have the entire church, everybody accept him as Pope, then he still is Pope. But he's still going to the title of Pope-elect because of that final confirmation has yet to be granted. But he's telling him, if you do this, don't expect me to just turn a blind eye to all of your sins. If you do in fact confirm me as the next pope. That you do that as emperor, or at least as someone who should be the emperor. Technically, he was never crowned emperor. Henry IV. He's technically king of Germany, but he's never underwent the actual crowning as emperor. But he's the one who should be, and so he's still being treated as emperor in many cases, in many ways. And he still is referred to as generally as the Emperor Henry IV, even though he was maybe not technically, but in effect, in practice, he was. There was nobody else who was any closer to it. So the king needed not these threatening words to urge his refusal. In his view, an election held without his cooperation was null by the very fact. Of course, that's not true. He gets to confirm it, but he doesn't get to dictate every ballot cast in the conclave, which clearly wasn't even necessary in this case. On the other hand, the German bishops who dreaded the firmness of Hildebrand advised the king to withhold his consent, but the fear of arousing all Italy by this act of hostility against a lawful choice, unanimously approved by every honest heart, led him in this case to sacrifice his own inclination. There must have been a very strong, a very strong motive indeed to get Henry IV to not to insist upon his own agenda in that moment. So he purely and simply confirmed the election of Gregory VII and set the Bishop of Vercelli to assist in his aim at the installment of the new pope. That was in June. So we have already pointed out the great evil which rent the bosom of the church by the abuse of investitures. So that's just a way of saying causing problems. Nothing could ever divide the church, in fact. But that's just a way of saying that this was causing issues. So great evils caused by this serious problem of the abuse of investitures introduced into France and Germany by the feudal system. So remember, the feudal system is the system which we're clearly in the Middle Ages at this point, perhaps on the earlier end of them, but definitely in the Middle Ages, during which the system of government in Western Europe and all these Catholic nations, and they are truly Catholic nations, is all based upon the practice of taking oaths of fealty. So every subject would take an oath of fealty to his liege lord, who would himself take an oath of fealty to the noble who was above him in the hierarchy of the nation, and so on and so forth, to the point that actually things eventually came to be that the Pope was technically the liege lord of all of those nations. And that he would, there was no sense of the Pope, that the Pope would actually rule those nations, but that they were symbolically given, maybe truly, but perhaps in practice it was more of a symbolic thing, but in theory, truly given to the Pope, as these kings would present their nations to him, in a sense, donate them to the Holy See, donate their kingdoms to the Holy See, who would accept them, the Pope would accept them, but then give them back to those kings to be ruled over as as a fief, as it were. So that was the system. It was all based on oaths of fealty. Keep that in mind. That an oath of whatever thing it is that someone is swearing is a spiritual thing. An oath is a spiritual thing. For example, in a court of law, calling upon God to witness the truth of what one is saying, that is in a sense a religious act. Calling upon God himself to witness the truth of something. And so it is an oath is a spiritual thing. Our oath could be a promise, a solemn promise made to God to, or a vow is a solemn promise made to do something that is particularly pleasing to God. But an oath could just be a promise to do something. Promise made to God to do something. So these are all spiritual things. The church can dispense from all those. Keep that in mind. That's how the system came about in the Middle Ages, that the Pope could effectively depose a ruler. Because everything's based on these oaths of fealty. If the oath of fealty were to be dispensed with for any reason, as the church could do at any moment, then effectively that person would lose all his subjects. Because they would no longer be bound to obey him, because their oaths of fealty, because of which they had been bound, were no longer in force. Had all been done away with. So, of course, nowadays, that's not how things work. Nothing. The system of government in no country is based on oaths of fealty anymore. But in the Middle Ages, they were. And so that was widely recognized to be the case, that the Pope could do this. Could do that if he saw fit to do so for any reason. So on the subject A particular author remarks that the freedom of the ecclesiastical ministry was utterly annihilated when the choice of bishops and abbots was left to the will of the secular princes. And that was an unfortunate side effect of the feudal system. There's nothing wrong with that in itself. It's actually a very good system, all considered in itself. But it also meant that, yes, bishops and abbots were worked into the system of government in various nations. And that's not ideal, for one thing, because ecclesiastics should be paying attention to the government and the running of the church. It's not intrinsically wrong that they be involved in the civil government, but it's just not ideal. It really should be focused on the resources, and that's a principle that has also been abused, has been invoked by those who want to just steal the property of the church, and the church should focus on spiritual things. Well, the church needs resources, but the church should focus on the things of the church. Those who are in high positions in the church need to make ecclesiastical concerns their primary focus. And so they're being worked into the civil government is not ideal, and not intrinsically wrong, but just not ideal. And then also it gives rise to this evil that, okay, well, the civil ruler then, yes, whatever power that such ecclesiastics may have in the civil order does come, all authority comes from God, but their power in the civil order comes from the king of the nation, most immediately, or perhaps more immediately anyway than even the Pope. Even in the situation in which the Pope is theoretically the liege lord of all Europe. So because they gave the power in the civil order to at least immediately or more immediately than anybody else to the nobles in question, who might include ecclesiastics. They started thinking, okay, we can also give them the symbols of spiritual power, and they have no authority to give that. Obviously, even if a bishop is a ruler in the civil order as well as being a bishop of a diocese in the ecclesiastical order, still, whatever power is given to him by the civil power is purely that, a power of the civil order. And the state remains, even when church and state are united, still the state remains completely incapable of granting any spiritual jurisdiction. The church might be involved in granting civil jurisdiction in certain cases, but the state can never be involved, can never be the source, we'll put it this way, of granting spiritual power. And so it is an abuse that any civil ruler should ever attempt to give those symbols of spiritual power. Mainly the mitre and crosier, obvious symbols of the episcopate. Also used by abbots, and those are just general symbols of jurisdiction. Not everyone who's ever used those has been a bishop. So abbots, even if they're not bishops, but who have power in the church over their territories, very similar to those, or even the same powers in many ways as those of a bishop of a diocese, would therefore also be given the symbols of power that the bishop of a diocese uses, the mitre and crosier. So that remains true. Even in the Novus Ordo, that's maintained to some extent. Still, there was one of his videos on the new Mass. Father Cicada had a picture of some kind of Novus Ordo, the church of some kind of abbacy or abbey or monastery, and called the very ugly abbot's crosier. He said that misshapen ping pong paddle over at the side is the abbot's crosier because it looks like that. The point being that even Novus Ordo, they still use those symbols to some extent. And they make them horribly ugly. They can do everything, but they still have maintained that. You see those. If you ever have the displeasure of coming across any recordings of Novus Ordo ceremonies on the internet, you could see just, they still use mitres and crosiers, but they just make them to be as horrible as possible. That's on purpose. They like it that way. They want it that way. Anyway, so this is the question of lay investiture that we're talking about. Again, it's not something that really ever comes up today much, but it is something that was a serious problem at the time that we're looking at. So, the freedom of the ecclesiastical ministry was utterly annihilated, so the civil power, as is almost always the case in pretty much every clash ever between the church and the state, it's a case of the state encroaching on the rights of the church. If there was ever a case of any ecclesiastic encroaching on the rights of the state, it's a rare case that would cause any major problems. Very rare. Can't think of a single one. You might be able to come up with something, but it's hard to think. It's hard to come up with even one. So kings unscrupulously auctioned, so sold off to the highest bidder, the dignities of the church to replenish their treasure or to meet the drain of ceaseless wars. So, the wars, in fact, cost money, a lot of money. Typically, the bigger the war, the more expensive, of course. And that's just pure expenditure in most cases. Even if wars are fought over resources, it may well happen that the resources being fought over are lesser than the resources expended in the waging of the war. That can happen. And so a nation even could be, because it has to spend so much of its resources on a war, they might technically win, but it might be, as they call it, a Pyrrhic victory in many senses. Which is, say, you've technically won, but you've been so badly bloodied in the fight that you're effectively dead. Having won, but dying effectively, in some sense, in the process of winning. So you've won, but you're also dead, just as your opponent's dead. Maybe you killed him in some sense, at least by defeating him, but you're not much better off than he is. So, in cases in point, in recent centuries, both France and Britain after World War I, they technically won, but in many senses they lost badly. France was effectively put out of the fight even before the war was over, but Britain lost badly as well in terms of their resources and how much their empire was weakened as a result. It wasn't finished, and World War II more or less finished off the British Empire, or at least it didn't last very long after, but they were greatly weakened after the first one. And so that's, indeed, that was the biggest war ever seen. That lasted for years, and nobody expected it would do that. Everybody knew a big war was coming, but nobody thought it would last as long as it did, or be nearly as costly as it was. So, anyway, wars are extremely expensive, and wars were still being fought at this time. Most of them smaller at this point, but still costly. And if it's being fought, as he says, ceaselessly, as our author points out, ceaselessly, then obviously that's constant expenditure. And wars are typically that, just expenditure. So St. Anselm thus speaks of Henry IV. This prince sells bishoprics without the least scruple. That's, of course, just pure simony. He has promulgated a decree annulling the episcopal elections held according to the holy canons by the clergy or the people, without the intervention of royalty, as though he were charged to open the door to the lawful pastors. No one is now raised to that dignity unless he open the way with bribes, or prostitute his eloquence and his hand to the service of his master. So that's St. Anselm. The public opinion of the times looked upon the bestowal of the ring and crozier as the conferring of the spiritual authority. As indeed one might well look at it that way. And those are symbols of office that are given in the ceremony of episcopal consecration. The mitre, the crozier, the ring, episcopal ring. And of course, in the ceremonies of episcopal consecration, it's the power of orders that is being conferred. Still, all of that is very clearly ordered towards jurisdiction. And that is also clear from the words of the ceremonies of the Church of episcopal consecration. Not the essential form, let's be clear about that, but in the other prayers associated with the conferring of the episcopacy upon a priest. It's clear, very clear, that this is meant to this bishop being consecrated is meant to go rule a diocese. Even if it doesn't actually happen, it's still ordered to it. Those are two separate powers. That's something that many times people get confused about. Sometimes it's an objection you see to the thesis, and by somebody who clearly knows next to nothing, but sometimes it does arise. Well, how can they be bishops elect because they're not validly consecrated? And the answer is that those two things have nothing to do with nothing to do with each other, but they are two separate things. It's possible to be, even prior to Vatican II, it was well within the realm of possibility that a bishop be a bishop of a diocese in terms of jurisdiction, but his episcopal consecration be invalid. That can happen. In fact, it even happened. It was clearly there are instances of bishops who were bishops in terms of power of jurisdiction, but definitely not yet in power of orders. So a priest who, in terms of power of orders, a simple priest, but who is already appointed the bishop of a diocese, already ruling the diocese, just not yet having undergone the ceremony of episcopal consecration. There are other instances of that. So those are two separate things. They're meant to go together. It's not supposed to be the case that you have a simple priest ruling a diocese in the place of a bishop. But it could happen, just whatever reason. So the bishop diocese needs to be set up in some place. Maybe the church has made suddenly a large number of converts in some area. It needs to be managed on the level of a diocese. And the only one to send there is the most senior priest in the region, and the Pope makes him, in terms of jurisdiction, a bishop immediately, even before another bishop is able to go there to consecrate him a bishop in terms of power of orders. That can happen. So they're meant to go together, most definitely. But it can't be that one have one and not the other. And for example, the phenomenon of auxiliary bishops, in terms of power of jurisdiction, diocesan priests, consecrated bishops to help go around do confirmations. Maybe ordinations in some cases. But auxiliary bishops were typically either the rector of the diocesan seminary or pastors of large parishes in the diocese. But in terms of power of order, of jurisdiction, it was rector of the seminary or pastor of a parish. Not far inferior in terms of power of jurisdiction to the diocesan ordinary. So, very, very understandably, the bestowal of the ring and crozier were looked upon as the conferring of the spiritual authority. So it is thus stated by the learned Cardinal Humbert, how are these laymen so bold as to assume the right of bestowing upon bishops the badges of the apostolic authority? The crozier is the emblem of the pastoral charge of souls entrusted to them. The ring is, so to speak, the seal of the heavenly mysteries, which the sacred orators are commissioned to dispense. To keep in mind, it was typical around this time when, with official correspondence, to seal the letters with wax and to use the ring to make an impression upon that wax seal before it hardened, so it would be clear from whom this comes. So there were rings that were sometimes specifically designed to be exactly that, seal on correspondence. So by analogy, the ring is, so to speak, the seal of the heavenly mysteries, which the sacred orators are commissioned to dispense. A sign that they are commissioned to do that. Just as the seal on the letter is a sign that it's from some particular person. And so investitures thus constituted a real usurpation of the secular power upon ecclesiastical ground, as we said. Another equally lamentable result was the disorder of scandalous priests who, under the name of the Nicolaites, opposed in teaching as shamefully in practice the apostolic doctrine of clerical celibacy. So clearly, from the earliest centuries of the Church, clerical celibacy has been observed, even required, as a general rule. Any instances of clerical celibacy not being maintained, but still the priest in question being allowed to function in good standing, not considered to be in violation of any law, is by exception. Yes, there are certain Eastern rites that are allowed. The married priests are tolerated. That's the way to look upon it. This is something tolerated by the Church in certain places in order to avoid greater evils. But most definitely, it's nothing more than just letting this go for the sake of avoiding greater evils or bringing about some greater good, typically to prevent those areas from going into schism. But it's definitely not considered the ideal. No, certainly in no case is a priest required to marry, and even then there's significant restrictions upon when they're allowed to see their wives. It is greatly restricted. So it's always been the case. The Church has clearly always considered a clerical celibate priesthood to be effectively necessary. and you consider all of the duties of the married state, it's when you really have a good understanding of what all of those are, realize that living a celibate life is actually much easier. There's no question about it. Yes, it is a much higher state. The stakes are higher in themselves. The dangers are objectively greater, but in practice, it's easier to deal with all of that. Now, objectively, it might be more difficult, but I can only say it's subjectively easier. Whereas given actual circumstances, especially today, it's much easier. There's much less risk of many things involved. So we could go on about that for a long time, but the point is that there's a myriad of excellent reasons why the church requires clerical celibacy. So nobody who opposes that has any leg to stand on. So our author doesn't even go into much in detail of the errors of these people because it's just so obvious. So men whose days had been wasted in the license of the camp. So let's typically that means military camps, which have been throughout time. Armies, militaries in general have been places of vice. For whatever reason, it's just always been the case. Any instance of that not being the case is the exception rather than the rule. So men whose days had been wasted in the license of the camp, so maybe they were in the army or something, and so they had long habits of vice that they were having a hard time shaking, but then for whatever reason pursued the priesthood. Or the corruption of courts. So again, civil courts, places you expect to be filled with all kinds of moral corruption. It's terrible, but it's hardly unexpected or surprising when you hear of it being the case. So when they were suddenly raised by the whim of princes or their own simoniacal cupidity to the dignities of the church, presented with benefices involving the care of souls, or placed at the head of monasteries. So they may have been, say, military lowlifes, in the sense that some militaries in many cases do attract people of very low life who have a sense that they need to get their act together somehow, but don't have the personal discipline to do it. Yeah, they don't have the discipline to you just get a simple job and show up for it. They don't even have that. They realize they need somebody who's really screaming in their faces to get them to do anything, just to keep some semblance of external discipline. So sometimes people went to any military at any time in history just for that reason. Just because they have a sense, okay, I really need some help here. And no one else is going to give it. So, okay, enter the army, where you have to maintain that, or you get screamed at, or kicked out, or worse things happen. Might even get shot for insubordination, or somehow killed. And some people, and that's not an uncommon thing. Not at all. So that could be the case. Or just people who are, in some sense, hired guns. Obviously, this time in history, there are no guns, but hired guns in the sense of people who are mercenary soldiers who make a living off of fighting. That obviously doesn't sound like something that would attract personalities of high principle. People who just kill for a living. Don't really care what the cause is. They just go to fight for whoever's paying them. So yeah, you couldn't say universally that such people would be of low character, but you can see how that wouldn't attract very people of high principle as a general rule. All right, and so to the discharge of these new duties, they brought all their former habits of immorality, as is typical. But it's also a good consideration for those who are pursuing the priesthood that when you enter the priesthood, you are the same person that you were before. You're not. Yes, the graces of state are there, and it can happen that somebody be transformed. But as a general rule, you are after ordination what you were before. Yes, you can see it. Definitely a progression. A continued advancing in sanctity, certainly, in priests, as in fact needs to be the case. But as a general rule, again, we've talked about that in one of our most recent spiritual conferences, why those exhortations exist for ordination. If you've been drunk up till now, be sober. If you've been unchaste, now be continent. All of that in very exhortations, more really just reminders, because hopefully all that's been dealt with. If that's not been dealt with, something's wrong. But all of that's there just to make it clear. This is where you need to be at this point. because if you haven't been prior, then you won't be later. So just a reminder of all of that. And so, yes, the graces of state are certainly available. Even someone who shouldn't have been raised to the priesthood, for whatever reason, didn't have a vocation before, can still, it's not as though that person is doomed to hell as a result. It'll be difficult for that person, certainly. But the vocation, in some sense, can come. Vocation can be granted. It is a gratia gratis data that God can give to even to someone who didn't previously have it. It can be lost by someone who did have it. If vocation is not nurtured, if it's not pursued, and formation for the priesthood not sought after, the grace of vocation can be lost. And so it also can be given. God can grant it to someone who didn't have it previously, but even if things will be difficult for that person, it can still be done. Graces of state can still see to it that someone who might not be particularly well qualified for the priesthood still carry out the function of the priesthood, ultimately in a worthy fashion. But typically, which you are before ordination, you remain after, for better or worse. So, also evil is naturally contagious, and it soon spread with fearful rapidity. Priests were publicly married, or supposedly so anyway, and lived in a state of incontinence. So, of course, at the reception of subdiaconate, it becomes impossible for the cleric to marry validly without a dispensation of the Holy See. So some vows, for example, are actually private and simple vows, even of not to marry, or such vows of chastity or celibacy, make an attempted marriage, even if it's in a religious congregation, a simple vow, not a solemn vow, which is a different story, but even a simple vow taken in a religious congregation still renders an attempted marriage illicit but not invalid. Mortally sinful to contract, but still be valid. Whereas a solemn vow taken in a religious order, that renders it invalid. But the point is that there are some vows even that don't render a marriage invalid. Whereas at subdiaconate, it's the cleric completely gives up the right to marry to the point that it would be invalid to attempt it. Yeah, without a dispensation of the Holy See. Now, the Holy See can do whatever it wants with regard to all of these things. But today, there's nothing that can be done about that, for sure. So there were whole dioceses in which not a single minister of the altar could have been found worthy of his holy calling. This lamentable state of things was the result of lay investiture. The first act of the new pontiff, St. Gregory VII, was directed against the scandals in the priesthood, as is indeed the first concern of the Pope, to deal with the priesthood. You see that just how many, all the spiritual conferences that I give are just based on encyclicals, even in mandate cases, just parts of encyclicals written by various popes, all of whom cover much the same ground. They point out various different aspects of things to be observed by priests, by those pursuing the priesthood. But clearly you can see just how much in the forefront of the mind of every pope is the maintaining the good formation and the sanctity of the priesthood. As I say, good formation and sanctity in the members of the priesthood. So it is clear, if the members of the clergy are not what they should be, then the lay people will never be ever. There's no question about that. It just will not be the case. According to the ordinary course of things, that will never happen. So in 1074, after a full council which nobly seconded the endeavors of St. Gregory VII, a withering decree was published against those priests who had bought their holy office for gold, or who profaned it by their loose morality. All those who refused to forsake their scandalous manner of life and return to a state of continence were to be at once deposed, to be deprived of all their powers, and the faithful were forbidden to assist at the masses or offices celebrated by these rebel priests, or to receive the sacraments at their hands. And that is it, the only way to deal with that. So the immensity of the evil thus attacked was made fearfully evident by the general uprising against St. Gregory VII and the publication of this decree. Theologians were found so lost as to maintain that continence was a virtue impossible practice to human nature, and they even claimed to support their teaching by the authority of Holy Writ, so sacred scripture. Of course, there is no such verse of sacred scripture that says that. Whatever they might be citing, they're misunderstanding. But this sounds all like Martin Luther, actually. And he will come centuries later, but this is reminiscent of things he would say later on. Not making excuses for sin. That was impossible anyway. It's not. Yeah, the concrete examples of the lives of the saints prove that it's not. That's a typical excuse. It always brings to mind it's actually a verse from one of the Psalms, but it's a prayer that's said during the incensation of the altar, the offertory, by the celebrant as he incenses the altar. The part of the Dirigator Domine, Oratio Mea prayer. And the end of it is, may I not, please guard me against the urge to make excuses for sins. And that's something you see all the time. That is, in fact, that's in sacred scripture itself. A mention of avoiding making excuses for sins means that that's something to which fallen human nature is inclined to do, to sin and to make it seem like something good. Remember, nobody can ever look upon himself as being evil. No one can ever consider himself a bad person. Even if somebody is objectively living a horrible, sinful life, he's still going to do something to try to convince himself that he's actually good. You just think of bosses of organized crime who make all kinds of money and drugs and prostitution and all kinds of horrible things. They go and kill people all the time, or at least orchestrate their killings. But they still, they take some of that money that they earn from all that stuff, and they might use it to buy a stained glass window for the church, even for the Catholic Church. And they'll imagine that they're good people because of that, or they use some of that money to open soup kitchens or something, and so they'll do those things to convince themselves that they're actually good people, despite all the horrible things they're doing. It doesn't work that way, but everyone's going to do something to try to convince himself that actually I'm a good person, really, despite everything. And no, everybody does that. If someone's not truly pursuing sanctity, truly pursuing goodness, meaning, of course, the state of grace, and seeking to remain in it, then there's something else he will do to try to convince himself he's good while being in the state of sin. So, making excuses for sins, in other words, is a very common thing. Or at the very least, to minimize it. Now, today you can see that sins against the virtue of chastity which is always grave matter, always. If ever sin against the sixth and ninth commandment is only a venial sin, it's due to lack of sufficient deliberation or full consent, or perhaps both. But it's always grave matter in itself. Whereas today it's looked upon as being, by most people, there's still a sense that it's not good, but it's looked upon as being what we would, nobody says it explicitly, but a sense of that's light matter at the worst. All kinds of sins, grave sins against the virtue of chastity are understandable faults and weaknesses. So such as general laxity, but that's the case. Just considered normal. Maybe shameful. There's still a sense that it's shameful to some degree, not much, perhaps, but there's still some sense that this is, it's really not good. It's really shameful. It's got a little bit embarrassing, maybe, but these sins are, people do that. These are things that you'd be guilty for. Just one of them, die and repent of that and go to hell for eternity. Just a fact that's how it is. Right, so that is the extent of laxity and the different ways of, you might, in some sense, making excuses for sin. So the immensity of the evil thus attacked, so we said that was made fearfully evident by the general uprising against St. Gregory VII and the publication of this decree. So others pleaded prescription, as if crime could ever establish a prescriptive claim against law, and they appealed to the disorders of the lamentable period through which they had just passed as a justification for their own. So prescription, generally speaking, is typically again, this is a stretch even of the general principle, but to gain possession of something by prescription is to gain possession of it in such a way that there was the whatever legal claim there may have been, if any at all, at the beginning was doubtful at best, highly dubious, but someone just remained in possession of something for a long time without any contest, without any dispute, then that person gains a right to that thing. So that's where such notions as squatters' rights come from. That actually has a basis in moral theology. In other words, you might somebody just goes into an unoccupied house. Maybe it's owned by someone else, technically, but the person just sets up camp there, just lives there for years, and the owner just, for whatever reason, never comes by to check. And that person's been living there for 10 years or something, and then comes back, oh, by the way, this is my house, you have to get out. But why did you say nothing for 10 years if you really, really want this place? Why did you say nothing for such a long time? Well, by that point, you can't just be kicked out. And so that's a claim based on prescription. And if that person would have that, if that were to go to court to be contested in a civil court, then the squatter, as it would be called, would be considered, the person has a right to be there now. The owner wanted that person gone, should have said something 10 years ago. Now, sometimes today, that made headlines a couple of years ago, I remember, I think it was in New York, but some places have far too lax laws about this kind of thing, and there were instances of people who would go back to second homes that they owned after maybe 30 days, not very long from being away, to prepare it for a rental or something, find people living there, and then the police telling them, oh, we can't kick these people out, they've been there for 30 days, so now they have a right to be there. That needs to be longer than 30 days. That law is heavily, that's an unfair law in favor of those who are just living there without owning it. But there is, for that general idea, prescription, there is definitely a basis in moral theology. But there is no such thing as prescription. Nobody who's a cleric who's been living in concubinage for a long time can't say, oh, prescription. Doesn't work that way. Crime cannot claim prescription against law. That's just absurd. So it is another thing that the enforcement of a law is part of its interpretation. But clearly the enforcement of the church has always been that clerics have to observe that perfect celibacy, perfect continence, perfect chastity that they're bound to. The enforcement of the church has made that constantly clear. Maybe sometimes the enforcement is better than others, but that's clearly enforcement has always sent that same message. Clearly. So, finally, there were many who, without touching the grounds of the doctrine, sought to weaken the authority of the decree by intrinsic considerations. They maintained that it was very dangerous to forbid the faithful to receive the sacraments from the hands of scandalous priests, since this would make laymen the judges of ecclesiastical questions, and besides, it seemed to place the efficiency of the sacraments in the holiness of the minister. So this line of argument was more particularly adopted by the bishops of Italy, France, and Germany. So the answer to that is, make it clear that anybody who is living in this way, and that's public, is not allowed to function in the priesthood, and to make it clear exactly who those are as far as possible. So that there is no such question of those things. Not making this is not a layman a judge of ecclesiastical questions. In any case, that's strictly speaking, that's not what's happening here. In any event, it's just requiring them to act in accordance with ecclesiastical decrees. But the answer, how to any such concern as there might not be any priests left. The answer to that is, it's better that there be no priests in some place than bad priests. That's definitely the lesser evil. An evil, sure, but a much lesser one. By far, no question at all. And seeming to place the efficiency of the sacraments in the holiness of the minister, there might be a perception of that. There might be some inclination that people perceive that, but that's something that would only be per accidens, an accidental result of something necessary, an unintended one. And the people need to be instructed that that's not the case here. We're not saying, don't imagine that the sacrament's invalid if the priest is publicly sinful. That's not the teaching of the church. It's a question of of making sure that nobody administers the sacraments validly but sacrilegiously, because those two things can go together. To minister of a sacrament or the priest celebrating mass in a state of sin, as horrible thing as it is to consider, is possible, and it is sacrilegious for the one who does it, as a sin of sacrilege, the abuse of a sacred thing. So blinded by the passions and prejudices of the hour, they could not see the sophism which would deprive the ecclesiastical authority of the right of ever deposing an unworthy priest. So you might sometimes think that this or that decree of a pope or this or that way of dealing with some problem might not be the best possible way, or perhaps, but you still have to conform to it. There's a true command, something that is ultimately sanctioned by the authority of Christ himself. And so it must be conformed to, no question. So in proportion as the protestations became more numerous, pressing, and energetic, the resolution of Gregory VII became more fixed and irrevocable. So a lot of people might crack under the pressure. He became firmer. He sent copies of the decree to the various Catholic sovereigns of Europe, together with urgent letters to arouse their zeal in carrying it into effect. His legates were favorably received by the King of Germany, but the German bishops rejected all the measures proposed to them, and the mission of the papal envoys failed in this quarter. They met with no better success in France. In England, William the Conqueror showed more energy in carrying out St. Gregory's views. With the cooperation of Lanfranc, lately transferred from the, that's a typo for sure, from the Abbey of Bic to the Archiepiscopal See of Canterbury, he enforced the Pope's decrees throughout the whole extent of his kingdom. So notice this, and we're looking at the late 11th century, while William the Conqueror is still personally ruling England. You already have the See of Canterbury being the foremost see in England. That would remain so for a long time, until the time of Henry VIII, when they, of course, would become something occupied by illegitimate Anglicans. So by the reception given to his first measures, St. Gregory VII could judge of the precarious nature of his position. There was a spirit of rebellion against the Holy See on these matters, even on something just as basic as clerical celibacy. And that's something even today, with all that general laxity we've been talking about, there's still, people do still have obviously connect celibacy with the priesthood. But that's something everybody knows is the case. It's still considered normal, even today. So and just imagine at this time, open protestations against the requirements, just all laws that are already in force, but just the requiring of the observance of those laws in the practical order, calling forth such protestations, just to consider how bad that is, just how terrible the state of affairs must be when that's the case. This was a rough time for the church in many ways. Because today, objectively, things are worse, even if maybe not in this particular respect with regard to actual clergy, hopefully. And the Novus Ordo things are, you could say, in certain ways, they don't try to marry, but they do commit all kinds of sins against the virtue of chastity that cause dioceses to go bankrupt over the lawsuits that occur as a result. And that's true. That's a serious problem. A lot of dioceses, Novus Ordo dioceses, are having serious financial difficulties because they get sued by so many victims or victims' families of all kinds of abuse cases. It's a widespread thing. Every story that comes out of the Novus Ordo, just imagine how, or maybe don't, but just consider how bad you think things are in the Novus Ordo, and they're far worse. Just even worse than you even thought was possible. The things that people do and the ideas that they come up with. I think this, it's like they're being fed their ideas of what to do and what to say by the devil himself. It's just so unimaginably bad. It's incredible. And you could not, we always say, whenever you hear those stories, you couldn't make this up. You could not make it up. You wouldn't think of it in your worst nightmares, some of this stuff. And somehow they come up with it. Things to do and say that are just so unimaginably horrible that you think it sounds like it comes directly from hell. It's just so completely twisted. So, he, St. Gregory VII, now resolved to sap the very foundation of the evil, and in a council held at Rome in 1075 AD, he issued a second decree forbidding any layman of any rank whatsoever, whether emperor, marquis, prince, or king, to confer the investiture, and any cleric, priest, or bishop to receive it for benefices, abbacies, bishoprics, and ecclesiastical dignities of whatsoever nature. Though one may keep the government of a church bought for money by a seminarical traffic. So traffic in this case meaning just a dealing, an attempted business dealing, really. Incontinent clerics are suspended from the exercise of all ecclesiastical functions, as well they ought to be. And you hear stories about that prior to Vatican II. And in cases of a priest who was caught fooling around, we'll say a car would show up outside the rectory in the middle of the night, and the offending cleric in question would be loaded up and never seen or heard from again. Just made to disappear. Going off to where? No, in probably different places in different cases, but definitely never seen saying Mass ever again. That's for sure. Or administering the sacraments. Just gone. That will not be tolerated, because it cannot be tolerated without serious problems potentially arising for the church. So that is the way to deal with it. And that sent a very strong message to everybody that this will not be tolerated. It might happen. And unfortunately, fallen human nature remains fallen human nature, despite the best efforts to provide good formation for the clergy. But any such case that has been prevented against, and it's always been explained to everybody as they pursue the priesthood, just how this will be dealt with. It will be dealt with the maximum possible severity to maintain for the good of souls, ultimately, also to maintain the reputation of the church and the reputation of the priesthood. Domine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, men sub tuum presidium confugimus Sancte Rei Genitrix, nostras supplicationes et despicias in necessitatibus, sed periculis cunctis libera nos, semper virgo Deus et benedicta. Domine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.